Absolutely. Here's an approximately 750-word expansion of Key Point 1, prayer as alignment, not escape, integrated as though it's a segment in the larger speech, delivered in the passionate, relatable, story-driven style of Sarah Jakes Roberts, but without explicitly naming her, and still carrying the Alan Watts, like philosophical depth underneath. No headings, seamless flow, and ending with a powerful closing line for impact. When we talk about God shielding the woman who prays, we have to start by understanding what prayer really is. See, sometimes we think of prayer like a hotline we dial in emergencies, like God is up there on some cosmic switchboard waiting for our calls so he can swoop in and fix everything on demand. And I've been there. I've prayed prayers with tears streaming down my face, begging God to make the pain stop, to change what seemed impossible, to remove every trace of fear or sorrow in my life. But the older I get and the more storms I've survived, the more I've come to realize that prayer isn't about escape. Prayer is not some secret password to a life free of hardship. It's alignment. When a woman prays, she's not trying to convince God to join her side. She's inviting her soul to rise and meet him where he already is. Prayer tunes us to the frequency of divine truth, the same way you'd twist the dial on an old radio, trying to clear the static until the music comes in strong and true. Because the static is always there, the static of fear, of bitterness, of shame whispering that you're not good enough. The static of comparison, scrolling through other people's highlight reels, wondering why your life doesn't look the same. But when you pray, truly pray, you're not escaping reality. You're letting God reveal reality's deeper layers. You're letting him show you that what looks like chaos is actually choreography, that what feels like rejection might be redirection, that the very place you thought was a prison might be the place God is preparing you for purpose. I can't tell you how many times I've prayed from a place of sheer desperation. Times I felt surrounded by darkness, unsure if I'd ever see the sun again. I'd come to God, fists clenched, trying to force him to change the situation. But somewhere in the middle of those prayers, my spirit would start to soften, my voice would drop. I'd go from shouting, "Lord, change it," to whispering, "Lord, change me." And that's when the real shielding happens. Because God doesn't always change the situation right away, but he changes the way we see it. He changes the woman who stands in the middle of it. Prayer is the space where your soul remembers who you really are, beyond the labels, beyond the mistakes, beyond the lies that negative feelings try to convince you are true. Prayer is the place where God reminds you that you are still chosen, still called, still loved, still shielded, even when life feels like it's falling apart. Sometimes the greatest miracle of prayer isn't that God removes the storm. It's that he makes you unsinkable in the middle of it. I remember a season when I felt completely undone. I was trying to juggle all the expectations, all the pressures, trying to be strong for everyone else while silently crumbling inside. I'd lie awake at night, my mind racing with every possible what if. And I remember praying one night, and all I could say was, "God, I don't even know what to ask you for right now." And right there, in that silence, I felt God remind me that he wasn't waiting for me to have the perfect words. He wasn't grading my prayer like some exam. He was waiting for me to surrender, to stop fighting so hard to control things, and just align my heart with his presence. And as I breathed in and out, I felt a peace settle over me, not because everything was suddenly fixed, but because I knew I wasn't facing it alone. That's how God shields the woman who prays, not by wrapping her in bubble wrap so nothing hard ever touches her, but by anchoring her soul so deeply in him that even when the winds howl, she knows she's held, Prayer is where you stop running from your feelings and start letting God transform them. It's where fear is met with faith, where anger is soothed by understanding, where shame loses its voice because love speaks louder. So if you're wrestling with negative feelings right now, if anxiety's got a grip on your chest or sorrow feels like a weight on your back, don't just pray to escape. Pray to align. Pray to let God adjust your vision so you can see the hidden beauty in the mess, the hidden strength in your spirit, the hidden shield that's been covering you all along. Because God shields the woman who prays, not by keeping trouble away, but by giving her eyes to see that He is right there in the middle of it all. And sometimes the real miracle isn't that the storm stops, but that you realize you were built to stand in it. Of course, here's an approximately 750-word expansion of Key Point 2, the dance of opposites, integrated seamlessly as though it's a segment of the speech, in a style akin to Sarah J. Roberts' story-driven, emotive, and conversational without naming her. It flows naturally from the prior key point and ends with a powerful single closing line for impact. And so once we learn that prayer is alignment and not escape, there's something else we have to come to terms with if we want to overcome negative feelings, and that is this: life is a dance of opposites. We like to think that if we just pray enough, believe enough, work hard enough, somehow we'll get to a place where everything is only light, only joy, only blessings stacked on blessings. And let me tell you, I'm a firm believer in miracles. I'm a witness that God can turn things around in an instant. But I've also learned that life, even when God is in the center of it, still comes with shadows, and that's not because God is punishing you. It's not because you're failing in your faith. It's because light cannot exist without darkness. Mountains cannot exist without valleys. The melody of life needs both the high notes and the low notes, or it's not music, it's just noise. Sometimes we get so caught up trying to push away the negative feelings that we end up giving them even more power. We think if I'm sad, it means I'm weak. If I'm afraid, it means I'm lacking faith. And before we know it, we're not only dealing with sadness or fear, we're dealing with shame about feeling those things at all. But what if I told you that God isn't intimidated by your shadows, that He isn't shocked by your anger, your doubt, your exhaustion? I've learned that God can handle all of it. He's not sitting on His throne shocked that you're struggling. He's the one who knitted every fiber of who you are. He knows you inside and out, and He knows that the same woman who laughs loud and dances freely can also be the woman who weeps into her pillow when no one's looking. I remember a time when I was going through a heartbreak so deep I thought I'd never recover. I'd be standing on stage, smiling, speaking faith and victory, and then drive home and sob in my car. I felt like two different people, like there was the strong me and the broken me, and I kept praying for God to make the broken part disappear. But one day in prayer, I felt God whisper in my spirit, "I'm not asking you to be only strong, I'm asking you to be whole." And that was a revelation for me. Because to be whole means embracing all of it, the joy and the pain, the courage and the fear. Negative feelings don't mean you're failing. They mean you're alive, they mean you're human, and more importantly, they mean there's something underneath those feelings worth paying attention to. Sometimes sorrow is a sign that you love deeply. Sometimes fear is a signal that you're stepping into something new and unknown. Sometimes anger is telling you that a boundary was crossed or an injustice needs to be addressed. When we pray, God doesn't always snap His fingers and remove those feelings. Instead, He invites us to look at them through His eyes, to see that what we're calling darkness might just be fertile soil where He's growing something new. And so, rather than fighting the feelings, we learn to sit with them, to say, "Okay, fear, what are you trying to tell me? Okay, sadness, what wound are you pointing me toward?" Because when we refuse to acknowledge the shadows, we miss half the story. We miss the depth, the compassion, the wisdom that can only be born in the dark places. I believe that's why God shields the woman who prays, not because he removes her from the dance of opposites, but because he teaches her how to move with it, how to bend and sway and not break, how to cry and still keep believing, how to feel grief and still have hope. There's a grace that flows when you realize you don't have to be all light or all dark, all strength or all softness. You're allowed to be both because God made you complex. He made you layered, and He's big enough to hold every part of who you are. So if you're feeling like your joy and your sorrow are taking turns on the stage of your life, I want you to know you're not broken. You're just dancing. And sometimes the very place you thought would break you becomes the place God uses to birth your greatest strength. Absolutely. Here's an approximately 750-word expansion of Key Point 3, the power of presence, seamlessly integrated as though it's part of the larger speech, in the emotive, engaging style reminiscent of Sarah Jakes Roberts, without naming her. It flows naturally from previous points and ends with a powerful closing line for impact. So after we learn that prayer is alignment and not escape, and that life is a dance of opposites, there's another truth we have to hold close if we're going to overcome negative feelings, and that is the power of presence. Let me tell you, it's one thing to talk about presence, and another thing entirely to live in it. Because the present moment is simple, but it's not always easy. Sometimes we'd rather live anywhere but here. We live in the past, replaying mistakes, wondering how things might have been different if we'd chosen this instead of that. Or we live way out in the future, playing mental movies of worst-case scenarios, worrying about problems that haven't even arrived yet. And before we know it, anxiety is living rent-free in our heads, and peace feels like a stranger. I've been there. I've sat in rooms full of people, smiling, nodding, acting like I was there, when my mind was racing 1,000 miles away. I've stood in front of mirrors rehearsing conversations I'd never actually have, planning how to defend myself, how to explain myself, how to prove I was worthy. But one of the greatest things prayer has taught me is that God doesn't meet us in yesterday, and He's not waiting for us somewhere out in tomorrow. He's here, right here, in this breath, in this moment, and when a woman who prays learns to anchor herself in the now, she finds out that the now is sacred ground. It's where God whispers truth that silences fear. It's where negative feelings lose their power to define her. Because the truth is, negative feelings thrive in the past and the future. Guilt and regret live in yesterday. Anxiety and fear live in tomorrow, but peace, that divine, unshakable peace, only lives in the present. I remember a season in my life when I was overwhelmed. I felt like I was being pulled in 100 different directions: family, ministry, people's expectations, my own expectations. I would pray and pray, but my prayers were frantic, like I was trying to keep God on my timeline, rushing Him to move faster. And one day, I finally sat still long enough to hear Him say, "Daughter, you're trying to run ahead of me, and that's why you're tired." I realized that all my striving, all my anxiety, came from trying to control things that hadn't even happened yet. I was praying for outcomes instead of presence. I was chasing certainty instead of seeking God's face. And so I started practicing the power of presence. When I felt fear creeping in, I'd stop and breathe. I'd remind myself, right now, in this second, I am safe. Right now, God is with me. Right now, there's enough grace for this moment. Sometimes it felt so small, like it couldn't possibly make a difference. But it did, because presence shrinks problems back down to their real size. Presence reminds you that no matter what's swirling around you, you have the right to peace in your soul. When you're present, you start to see beauty in places you'd overlooked. You taste your coffee instead of gulping it down while worrying about the next task. You notice the way the sunlight spills across the floor. You hear laughter and realize it's a gift. Even in hard moments, presence can be a refuge. You can sit with your sorrow without becoming your sorrow. You can feel anger without letting it drive your actions. You can acknowledge fear without letting it control your next step. God shields the woman who prays by drawing her into this holy moment, because the enemy loves to attack us in the mind. He loves to keep us trapped in what if and if only, but God says, "Be still and know that I am God." And it's in that stillness, in that presence, that negative feelings begin to lose their grip. I want to tell you that presence is not pretending everything is perfect. Presence is being honest about what you're feeling, while trusting that God is bigger than what you're facing. Presence doesn't mean you won't feel afraid. It means you'll remember you're not facing fear alone. It doesn't mean your situation will instantly change. It means you'll find strength to keep standing, even when the storm keeps raging. So, if you're feeling overwhelmed, if your mind keeps pulling you back into the past or dragging you forward into the future, I want you to pause. Right now, breathe, remind yourself that God is here, because the woman who learns to dwell in God's presence discovers a shield stronger than any weapon formed against her. And sometimes the victory is not that the battle goes away, but that you find peace in the very middle of it. Of course, here's an approximately 750 word expansion of key point 4, surrender, not struggle, woven seamlessly as part of the larger speech in the passionate, story-rich style reminiscent of Sarah Jakes Roberts without naming her. It flows naturally from the previous key points and ends with a powerful closing line for impact. So once we've learned that prayer is alignment and not escape, that life is a dance of opposites, and that presence is where we find our shield, there's one last truth we have to let settle into our bones, and that is the power of surrender. I know, surrender is one of those words that makes us tense up a little, because we live in a world that teaches us to fight for everything. To hustle, to grind, to never back down, and don't get me wrong, there's a time for fighting. There's a time for pressing forward and refusing to quit. But there's also a time when the greatest act of strength is not fighting harder. It's letting go, because God shields the woman who prays, but not by wrapping her in a life free of challenges. He shields her by giving her wisdom to know when to surrender. I used to think surrender meant giving up, like waving a white flag in defeat, but I've learned that surrender is not giving up, it's giving over. It's putting the weight you've been carrying back into God's hands. It's saying, "Lord, I trust you more than I trust my own plan." There's a difference between struggling to control life and surrendering to the one who controls it all. Struggle wears you out. Surrender sets you free. I remember a time when I was trying so hard to fix everything. Fix my circumstances, fix the people around me, fix myself. I thought if I just worked hard enough, prayed long enough, worried deeply enough, somehow I could bend life to my will. But all it did was exhaust me. I'd pray, but my prayers were really just anxious lists of how I needed God to make everything go my way. I wasn't praying to align my heart with God. I was praying to recruit him to my agenda. Then one day, in a moment of sheer frustration, I finally said to God, "I don't know what else to do." And I felt him say, "Good, now I can do what only I can do." And that's the mystery of surrender. Sometimes God waits until we stop striving so he can start moving. When you surrender, you're not saying the situation doesn't matter. You're saying you trust God's wisdom more than your own understanding. You're saying, Lord, even if it doesn't look like what I prayed for, I believe you're still working all things together for my good. Surrender means you stop measuring God's goodness by whether your life is easy. You start measuring it by the fact that He never leaves you even when life is hard. Negative feelings love to feed on our desire for control, because when things feel uncertain, our first instinct is to grip tighter. We think if we can just plan enough, manage enough, protect ourselves enough, we'll feel safe. But real safety, real peace comes from surrender. It comes from laying your plans, your fears, your expectations at God's feet and saying, have your way. I know that's not easy. Especially when you're in the middle of something painful, especially when the thing you're surrendering feels like your whole world. But I promise you, God has never asked you to let go of something unless He had something greater in store. Sometimes, the very thing we're gripping so tightly is the thing that's keeping us bound, and surrender is the key that unlocks our freedom. There's a story I'll never forget. A woman told me how she kept praying for God to save a relationship that was slowly destroying her. She prayed, fasted, fought with everything she had, and it wasn't until she surrendered, until she released it, that she realized God wasn't punishing her by letting it end. He was protecting her, shielding her, making room for the healing she didn't even know she needed. Surrender isn't passive. It's the most courageous thing you'll ever do. It takes faith to say, God, I don't have to understand everything to trust you. Because God shields the woman who prays not by removing all trouble, but by lifting the burden off her shoulders. He teaches her how to walk lighter, to breathe deeper, to live freer. So if you're carrying something heavy today, if your mind is spinning, your heart is aching, and you feel like it's all up to you, I want you to know, you don't have to hold it all. Put it in God's hands, because the miracle isn't always in getting what you want. It's in discovering that you were never meant to carry it alone.